I was driving home with my family after visiting my sister who lives a town over. I was learning how to drive, had a pretty good handle on it, and my stepdad let me drive there to get used to winter highway driving, so naturally I drove back as well. The storm wasn't supposed to start until later that evening, so we thought it would be fine. It started snowing when we left, which wasn't terrible because I was capable of driving in the snow, but it picked up fast. We had just left town and were maybe 10 minutes into the drive before it became a complete whiteout. I'm driving in the left lane. It's 8 p.m., middle of January, so it's pitch black in peak winter where I live. Not to mention, these are Canadian highways. The only lights you're getting for a long stretch are going to be your headlights. I was doing my absolute best not to panic, and was shocked at the level of calm I was able to muster. My stepdad was doing his best to guide me and try to find a place that was safe to pull over. But the winds were blowing snow everywhere, so we couldn't see the ditches or the lanes. I had two worries. One, I'm in the left lane, so if I pull over, I might not know how far exactly to go. It might throw us into a ditch that's completely filled with snow. Two, I can't see the lines at all, and if I keep driving, I might not stay in the correct lane because of that. The only thing I could really do was to keep driving until I was absolutely certain it was safe to pull over. I was using the rumble strips as my only guide since the tires were able to get a slight feel for them. I was only driving 30 kilometers an hour in a 90 zone. My stepdad is guiding me to the road his parents live on, so we can have a better place to stop. We passed maybe 8 cars in the ditch between my sister's town and my grandparents' road. At some point the road was completely covered, and the rumble strips weren't noticeable anymore either, so I was just going off of instinct. I ended up hitting a sheet of ice at an awkward angle and spun out into the oncoming lane. I got control of the car, saw faint headlights, and said, "Yeah, wrong lane. Shouldn't be here at all," and quickly but safely moved us back into the proper lane. My mom's in the back seat freaking the fuck out because we just spun out. My stepdad is surprisingly less chill than me, but still trying to keep his cool, doing everything he can to not grab the wheel in a panic. I can barely see an inch in front of the car now. I finally managed to get to his parents' road and pull over. We got out to switch places, and when I stepped out of the vehicle, the snow was up to my shins. We ended up staying the night at my grandparents' house, because there was no way in hell we were making it back home alive if we tried. Found out about 15 minutes after getting in that they closed off all the highways to poor conditions. We had to dig our way out of the house the next morning to go home. I got to stay home from school that day since I was stuck out of town, meanwhile everyone else had to go in. It was my first winter with my learners and my first blizzard drive. If we had a smaller car, we would have never made it to my grandparents' house to begin with. I was terrified, but I was not going to let my parents know that, especially with my mom in the back seat scared. I never should have driven that night, but it helped me learn how to handle those kinds of drives later on, and I became a better driver because of it. It was a fucking trip though, that's for sure. One I'll never forget. This was somewhere around 2005, during one of the worst blizzards we had that winter in Cleveland. My buddy's girlfriend had spent the night at our house, but had to be at work that afternoon. She set off early, giving her plenty of time to go slow and get there safe. She barely made it a mile before her car slid off the road and into a ditch. We jumped in my buddy's Jeep and headed down the road to give her a warm place to sit while we waited for help. After we got there and got her calmed down and warmed up, we assessed the situation. Her car was at a 90-degree angle to the road, with the front of her car pointed down into the ditch, her tail end sticking out into one of the lanes. The car didn't look damaged, so we decided to use the Jeep to try and pull it out of the ditch. The problem was that the car was sitting in a deep pile of snow that had gotten compacted under the car. We couldn't immediately get to the frame of the car to hook the winch up. We started digging the car out with a couple of shovels that were in the Jeep. It was really slow going and difficult. The wind was whipping through our clothes, and the snow was coming down so fast that it seemed like it was piling up as fast as we could shovel it. You literally couldn't see more than a couple dozen feet in front of you. My buddy and I were both on the driver's side of the car, digging around the rear wheel. There were headlights coming toward us from the passenger side of the car. We watched them for a second before realizing that they weren't slowing down, and they weren't changing direction to avoid the car in its path. I just remember thinking, "Oh, this is gonna suck," just as my buddy yelled, "Car! Go! Go! Go!" We both jumped from the side of the road, over the ditch and into a snowbank. I didn't see the collision, but I sure as hell heard it. I was still midair when the oncoming car slammed into the opposite side. I landed in some deep snow and braced for the worst. I had very little awareness of how much time had passed, and I was sure that I was about to be crushed. I finally opened my eyes when I heard my buddy's girlfriend screaming incoherently. She was running toward us, sobbing and freaking out. I looked down at my legs, and the trunk of the car was millimeters away from them. Had I not curled them up as I jumped clear, they would have been crushed under the car. My buddy had jumped farther, so he was completely in the clear. Regardless, both of our hearts were pounding from the adrenaline. Luckily, no one was injured in either of the accidents. However, when the tow truck finally pulled the car out of the ditch, I saw my shovel, sitting there, snapped like a twig, near where I had left it when we first saw the headlights, right where my legs had been moments before the collision. That snapped handle could have been my legs, or worse. January 13th, 1982 is a day I will never forget, but sincerely wish had never happened. I worked in an office building in Crystal City, Virginia, near the Pentagon. The day started normally. My wife and I carpooled, and I dropped her off at her job, and then fought my way through the DC traffic. Crossing the 14th Street Bridge into Virginia, I noted how the Potomac was still frozen. It started snowing not long after I got to my desk. I knew this meant the trip home would be a mess. I remember being glad that my car had enough fuel that I wouldn't have to stop on the way. The workday was normal stuff, reviewing some data and writing up reports. Next thing I know, we are told the office is shutting down early due to the weather. I called my wife and let her know that I was leaving the office early and heading her way. In Crystal City, all the parking is underground. With so many folks being released all at once, and the weather being this bad, it took me almost 45 minutes to get to the street level. What a mess. It took another hour just to get up near Boundary Channel Drive. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, but I had a single sideband CB radio, and like many folks was a member of a club, so I passed the time talking to a friend across the river at the Naval Research Lab. He wasn't making any more progress than I was. We were joking about who would get home first, and would we make it in time for breakfast. I guess we figured that nothing could be worse than being stuck in this awful traffic. He was having trouble getting back to his wife at their home radio, or base station. So I was relaying information to her while working my way up to the bridge in stop-and-go traffic. I remember now, her name was Tommy. Then, suddenly and unbelievably, I see a plane drop out of the snowy sky, hit the bridge, and crash, presumably into the river. It happened so fast that at first I doubted my eyes. Finally, my brain got to my tongue, and I said, "Holy shit, Tommy. A jet just crashed into the 14th Street Bridge. Call 911. Hell yes, I'm sure. Tell them it was a 737, and it hit the south span." Tommy called it in, and I slowly drove forward up to the crash site while confirming information to the folks on the other end of her phone. The plane had destroyed several cars on the bridge and knocked out the north side guardrail on its way into the Potomac. When the police got there, they closed the northbound traffic behind me, so here I was on this bridge trying to figure out how to help out. Some injured folks got on buses. Most were carried off in other people's cars. There was a truck designed for drywall with a boom hoist built into the bed. Apparently, the plane hit the boom and spun the truck around, so it was on its side, with the cab hanging off the bridge over the river. A guy crawled out of the passenger side window and made his way back onto the bridge. I asked him if he was okay, and he said yes. Then he got into another person's car, and they just drove off. You could see people struggling in the water, and one lady standing up on the ice. A crowd of people had gathered on the riverbank near the George Washington Parkway, and were trying to figure out how to get enough ropes together to pull some survivors to shore. Meanwhile, the electric bridge lights came on, highlighting the slowly falling snowflakes. I could hear a helicopter, hopefully coming to snatch the survivors from the ice and frigid water. A crash truck arrived, and I asked the fireman if I could help. He said, "No, all the injured have been evacuated, but hang around because we might need your radio." After about another 15 minutes, he said to go ahead and leave, because they would be bringing in crews to remove the dead, along with an investigation team. Driving away, there was no traffic at all, since the bridge had been closed behind me. Just the snow-covered Southeast-Southwest Expressway and me, thinking about how everything can go horribly wrong in just a split second. I was pretty new at driving, and coming home from work late one night, I decided it was the perfect time for my first drive across the lake. This was in Minnesota. Things were okay for the first few minutes, but as I got closer to the center of the lake, I started getting really nervous. It was really hard to see anything except the plowed path in front of me, and I realized I had no idea where I was going to come off the lake at, or if the path even went all the way across the lake. So I decided I would turn around and go home. As soon as I backed up off the plowed area to turn around, I was stuck in over a foot of snow. I tried rocking the car, tried putting my floor mat under the tire, which I just ended up flinging the mat 20 feet behind me, tried digging out with my snow scraper. The only thing I succeeded in doing was breaking a fingernail off, causing my finger to start bleeding. This was way before cell phones, so I finally decided that I needed to start walking towards home. I was probably 3 or so miles away. Unfortunately for me, the wind chill was about negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and I don't know if you've ever tried to walk across a frozen lake on a windy night, but a lake is pretty flat, and there's nothing to shield you from the wind. By the time I got off the lake, I was seriously thinking I was going to die of hypothermia. Not long after, I reached an area with houses, and my extremely introverted, shy, socially awkward self bravely decided that I needed to knock on a door for help. Someone finally answered. I explained my predicament and asked if I could use their phone. They said yes, and I called home, feeling relieved that help was within reach and enjoying the warmth of this stranger's house. My younger brother answered. I told him to get Dad, and he just said, "Nope." I told him he wasn't funny and I needed help, and then he hung up on me. I called back, but he must have left the phone off the hook because I only got a busy signal. After trying a few more times and feeling increasingly awkward, I decided the only thing I could do was walk the rest of the way home. So I did, my burning hatred of my brother and plans to beat the crap out of him keeping me warm. I made it home with only a little spot of frostbite on my finger. It was a hole in my glove. My brother got read the riot act by my dad, as did I for driving onto the lake. The next day, Dad drove me back to get my car, which thankfully hadn't been towed. I haven't had any interest in driving on a lake since. My best friend was supposed to get married on a day where we had a blizzard. Of course, the reception was canceled, but they were still hoping to get married. The pastor lived near the church they were supposed to be married in, and said that if they could make it in, that he would be happy to perform the ceremony. The interstate was closed most of the day, but finally in the evening, it opened up. They said to me that they were going to try. I really wanted to be there, so I hopped in my car and headed out. I was driving down the interstate, admittedly going a bit faster than I should have, when I started to slide. I overcorrected, and it turned into a full 360 spin. I vividly remember facing the headlights of the other cars on the interstate that were heading toward me. Also, it turns out that if you spin out, your engine turns off, so I couldn't even drive once I pulled out of the spin. I managed to coast to the shoulder where I was able to restart my car and made it to the church in time to see them get married. I was the only person who wasn't immediate family that made it, and was very happy to be there, and alive. On a really cold winter night, I was driving home. It had been snowing, and it was rather late. No traffic. I suddenly saw an old woman, dressed in a dark coat, at the side of the road. I assumed that she would just wait for my car to pass. When she was less than 1 meter away, though, she stepped into the road. I did not touch the brakes. There was ice under the thick blanket of snow, and I couldn't have stopped anyway. I had good experience driving under those conditions. I just turned the wheel a bit toward the middle of the road very gently, and left the car to slide. I was able to stop a few meters away. I got out of the car, got a torch, and walked back to see if the old lady crossing the street was okay, and to tell her to not pull that stunt again for her own safety. What I did not expect to see, though, was that the snow was untouched where she was standing. There was absolutely no footprints on the soft, fresh snow, and no sight of her anywhere. I mucked around a bit, wondering how the heck that could be. It was open space, so there was not much to see, and what was to see was crystal clear anyway. No footprints. No old woman. Nothing. I stepped on the snow to see if it was frozen. It wasn't. I could see my footprint clearly. It was indeed a thick coat of soft, fresh snow. There were no other footprints, though. I was relatively tired, but other than that, I was sober and in a good mood, and no mental health problems. I really didn't have an explanation, other than an optical illusion, but an optical illusion of a crystal clear pedestrian walking towards the side of your car, 1 meter away? I could see her very clearly. I shared this with a few friends and had been told, "That's a bloody dangerous place there. A lot of deadly crashes happening." Obviously, it gave opportunities to speculations about ghosts and crashes with no apparent causes for years to come. I can't comment on that, as I personally didn't crash. I was very well and sound, and there was very normal sight on a very normal night initially. The aftermath was just weird. This story takes place 4 years ago, and it still haunts me to this day. It was Christmas night, and my family were driving home from this fancy restaurant. I, unlike my family, wasn't tired, so the 45-minute drive seemed perpetual. On top of that, my sister was constantly moaning about how her friend didn't get her anything for Christmas. After about 20 minutes of driving, my dad stopped at a gas station to get some cigarettes, and my sister, brother, and mother all got out to pee. I stayed in the car as I had gone before we left. Once they all left, I decided to play a few games on my phone. I looked at the car clock and saw that 10 minutes had passed, so I immediately wondered what was taking them so long. As soon as I peered out the car window, I saw a man staring at our car. The man startled me, as I didn't know how long he had been watching. What made it even more unnerving was that he had a plain blank face. No expression was shown. It was really hard to make out any features, as it was pretty dark, and he wasn't standing in an illuminated part of the station. He was about 5'9" and looked to be middle-aged. Once he saw me notice him, he started walking towards the car, and I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't scared. Luckily, my dad came back with the rest of the family just as the man took a couple steps. My dad apologized and told me that he had been in an argument with the cashier. I didn't care, I was just glad that my dad was with me. I took another glance at the man outside. He was still just staring, but this time he had an annoyed look on his face. We drove off, and for the rest of the car ride, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. This wouldn't have been too bad if it had ended here, but it didn't. Later that night, I was watching YouTube while everyone else slept, and luckily for me, a snowstorm was raging over us. I enjoy storms. They make me feel cozy as I'm lying in bed. I put my phone down and just enjoyed the ambience. That didn't last for long, though, as I heard something smash into the window behind me. I lurched forward and nearly fell out of the bed. I thought a bird had just smashed into the window. I parted the blinds, and what I saw next haunted me. I saw a man standing out by my parents' cars, looking up at my room. I took a closer look, and I nearly had a heart attack. It was the same man that I saw at the gas station, only this time, when our eyes met, he grinned. Being the 14-year-old that I was, I did the manly thing and screamed at the top of my lungs. My dad came running down the stairs and entered my room. "Why the fuck are you screaming?" he said. I told him about the man and I explained everything that had happened. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and told me to call the police. After 10 minutes, the police turned up outside of our house and found the man in our shed. He got arrested, and that was the last time that I saw him. The next day, my dad inspected the house, and we found the handle of our back door had been damaged, but not completely broken. This gives me an incredibly eerie feeling, as if he actually managed to get in, he could have harmed us, or possibly even killed us. When I was 10 and my sister was 12, we traveled as unaccompanied minors on People's Express Airlines. We'd done this a lot, traveling between parents, and my dad got us to the gate, waited until we got on, and watched the plane roll off before he headed to the car and started his 3-hour drive back home. What he didn't know is, the plane never took off. It was New Year's Eve at Reagan National Airport and it was snowing. There was one delay, and then another, and another, and almost 2 hours after leaving the gate, the pilot got on the loudspeaker and told us that, unfortunately, we were not going to be leaving. He laughed and said how our congressmen needed their sleep and that no planes were allowed to take off after curfew. We went back to the gate and everybody got off, and that's when the stewardess and the checkout counter attendants informed us that, as unaccompanied minors, we were not their problem. Imagine that. They wouldn't budge, and 2 little kids were left to fend for themselves on a snowy night in a strange city in an airport that was closing down for the night. A man got on the loudspeaker and informed everyone that the doors would be closing, and any stranded passengers needed to make arrangements to be elsewhere for the night. Dad was long gone, and it was long before cell phones. We had no idea what to do, as the adults around us yelled and badgered the counter people for accommodations and transportation and took turns using the phones to get rides back to relatives. All we had was Dad's phone number, and we knew he wasn't home. A guy in a uniform told us it was time to go, and moved on to the next stranded traveler. A guy in a pilot's uniform brushed us off, pointing us back to the checkout counter where a large lady was losing her mind over not seeing her babies for the holiday. Another stewardess refused to even stop. A guy with a push broom worked his way by and eyed us. We had hysterics, and finally curled up with our stuff to cry under a little blanket we had. It got really quiet, just the sound of that push broom and the occasional clang of a trash can being dumped. Then the guy with the push broom worked his way back over. It was really hard to understand. His English wasn't good at all, but he asked us what was happening. We said our flight was canceled, and he was puzzled why we hadn't gone home. He listened to us for a while and then told us to come with him. He worked his broom and his trash to the front, found an admin, and talked to them for a long time. The admin guy finally came over and talked to us. He couldn't give us a place to stay, but he had us leave a message for our dad and stayed until Dad finally got in and called back. But he wasn't a People's Express guy. They were long gone, so technically we weren't his responsibility, and he wasn't taking us anywhere even if Dad called in to pay for accommodations, and he wasn't staying the night here either. And in the end, the guy with the broom said he'd be working all night anyway, so he'd watch us and everyone else left. He worked all night, and we slept at a cold, dark airport. The janitor guy kept checking back with his broom all night, then had us right there by the front when the doors were unlocked at 6, and my dad came charging in to raise hell with every airport and airline official he could corner. It was a different world back then, that's for sure. Thank you, janitor guy, for keeping 2 exhausted kids safe and comforted while my dad drove 3 hours back on Christmas Eve, and nobody else could be bothered to inconvenience themselves over us. You were great.